Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us, to your friends at CCIA. We're really happy to have you all with us today. We've actually have an entire week of webinars planned, so I'm going to run through a couple of those. But first, just to get us started, you are all going to be in listen-only mode, but you can submit questions via the question tab on the panel on the side of the webinar platform. So go ahead and submit questions. We're hopefully going to have some time at the end. If not, we'll certainly make sure that we give our guests printouts of the questions that were submitted. So add your name and your business too if you are going to submit questions. For those who don't know me, my name is Lindsay Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of the California Cannabis Industry Association, and very happy to be here this morning with our special guests. CCIA right now, for those who don't know, we are doing a membership drive. We are offering 20% discounts to anyone who is renewing or any new members to join CCIA. We know that a lot of businesses are going through a really difficult time with COVID and shutdowns around the country. So we want to keep our members engaged via our committees, and we invite all of you to join us if you're not already a member. This week we are doing a webinar, a panel of, or a series, excuse me, of webinars throughout the week. Tomorrow we have our risk management webinar at noon. You can sign up for all these webinars on our website, and we definitely encourage folks to RSVP. Risk management is going to be folks from our insurance and HR committee, answering a lot of questions about filing claims for theft, how to deal with all of the insurance issues around COVID. So that one should be super informative and very timely. On Wednesday, we're doing an update with our federal lobbyists, the liaison group, at 4 p.m. And this one will focus primarily on federal banking. So join us for that. On Thursday, we're doing business adaptation and some financial forecasting. And that one will be at noon. Again, you can sign up on our website. And then Friday, we're really excited. We're doing a 2-hour social equity update, both focusing on what's happening on the state, taking a look at CCIA's preferred language document that came out of our Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Equity Committee. And then our friends are from the Social Equity Owners and Workers Association is going to be joining us to discuss everything that's happening in LA with social equity. So that is our week. We hope that you can join us for all these educational webinars. You don't need to be a member of CCIA, although we do hope that you join if you're not. We just want to make sure that we're getting relevant and timely information out to all of you. So thank you so much. We're excited for this webinar this morning, taking a look at California cannabis policy and the latest developments with Amy Jenkins, who hopefully you all know is our Senior Director of Policy here at CCIA and our lobbyist. She is also the founder and president of Precision Advocacy, and also special guest Nicole Elliott, Senior Advisor on Cannabis to Governor Gavin Newsom. So thanks so much, ladies, for both being here. I am going to turn the microphone over to Amy.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Nicole. It's really exciting to be here. A little bit nervous about kicking off the week of webinars, so bear with me. But hope that you will enjoy the content today and that you'll tune into some of the other content that we have planned throughout the week. So excited to kick this off with Nicole. Nicole, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to have Justin just go ahead and hit the next slide, and maybe we just kind of do an overview of where we are. So you've heard many times CCIA kind of highlight some of our key policy goals. I thought I would just generally remind you this is essentially the policy that drives the work program of CCIA and tells me what I need to be doing as I'm communicating with legislators and members of the administration, including Nicole, as well as regulators. So obviously we continue to focus on retail access, reducing and eliminating taxes, simplifying the tax collection process, streamlining regulations, and removing barriers to entry. So those are really our core policy goals. I'm going to turn it over to the next slide because obviously we had a really interesting year with the pandemic. We had to pivot and adjust as the legislature and the administration had to do This has been a year unlike any other in my 25 years that I've been lobbying, and I can't believe I just admitted that. So this is a really interesting time for us. We started the year with well over 30 bills. We're now down to 11, and time permitting, I'll cover some of those at the end of the presentation today. But a lot of major adjustments. And so I thought about kind of highlighting some of the things that we're really focusing on in the current pandemic or post-pandemic environment, which is just a slight modification to what our core priorities have been for this session. But it's really now about, preserving and expanding safe retail access. So things like curbside, maybe expanding the delivery threshold. Those are things we're talking about. Streamlining our regulations in a manner that reduces cost pressures on licensees, as well as barriers to entry into the license system. Reducing the existing cannabis tax rates, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more today, as well as talking about future state stimulus efforts. There was a lot of good work that was done that I know Nicole is likely prepared to highlight around supporting small businesses, but that's something we're continuing to push in this new environment. And then providing banking access, and that is largely something our federal advocate Safira is doing, but there's also been some good work here as well at the state level. So next slide, please. So I thought I would just start on where we are. And funny thing is, this is already a dated slide because the last bullet, well, actually, it's not quite dated yet, but there has been agreement on the budget. So we don't exactly know what that looks like. Maybe Nicole does. But the legislature and the governor did reach agreement on the budget. Just to kind of back up a little bit, the legislature did exercise its constitutional requirement of approving a budget for the 2020-21 fiscal year on June 15th. The budget bill is SB 74 for the wonks out there. What it does is it closes a $54 billion projected deficit. So that was done through a combination of efforts. So reducing spending, drawing down reserves to the tune of about $11.8 billion, and then enacting various ways like funding shifts, sales and use tax changes, which totaled about $4.4 billion in savings to the general fund. It also assumes $14 billion in future stimulus aid, and that's been kind of the rub between the legislature and the governor is what it means if we don't get that funding, and what triggers would actually have to be enacted if we don't get that additional stimulus funding. So that's kind of the lay of the land. I would note, and we'll cover this in a little more detail in the future slides, there is an estimated $435 million in cannabis tax revenue. So that is the revenue assumption of what we will bring in cannabis taxes as part of this budget overview. Again, governor must sign by July 1st, and it looks like there is an agreement that's been reached today. I have no details on it. It literally just happened less than an hour ago. But there could be some additional modifications. I don't anticipate any around the cannabis portion of the budget, but I thought it was important to just provide kind of a general lay of the land. So next slide, please. So with respect to cannabis, I thought I would just give you a little bit of background, and Nicole and I have talked about this a lot, is I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to wanting to know how our cannabis tax dollars are being spent. I don't think that we've done enough to really focus on that, but I think it's important for all of you to know how that tax revenue is funding both priorities in terms of cannabis, but then also other state priorities. So this year, the cannabis tax revenues, the state assumes about $435 million that will be collected in this next fiscal year. And it assumes also a total fund balance of $731 million. So next slide, please. So what this does is it kind of breaks down the expenditures from the time that Prop 64 was enacted and took effect. So it kind of shows three buckets. And this is important and things that I have to pay attention to as a lobbyist. So the first bucket is also called Tier 1, and that basically funds the licensing entities and the administration of the cannabis framework. And that doesn't just include funding for the licensing entities. It's pesticide regulation, GoBiz. That is also the bucket that funds social equity. There's $15.5 million set aside for that in this current proposed budget. So tier 2, and this is all outlined in 64, this really focuses on dedicated spending around, it's like DUI drug impairment for the CHP. It also funds additional cannabis research. So this year's budget proposes to fund that at 45 million. This is all our tax revenues that are collected. And then this is the tier 3 bucket, and that's funded this year at 296, well, roughly 297 million. And this is kind of the bucket that gets really interesting. It's divided into 3 categories, which I'll highlight going forward. So Justin, next slide, please. So the tier 3 allocation is divided, it's a 20-20-60 split. So 60% goes to youth education, prevention, and early intervention. 20% at 59 million goes to environmental protection and restoration. And then the third bucket is state and local government law enforcement account. But this is not just law enforcement. There's a grant program I'm going to highlight later on in this presentation that provides potential funding that could benefit the industry. So I thought it was important to note. Next slide, please. So on this one, I just break it down a little bit further. So when you look at this bucket, this is 59 million. This is going to be for environmental cleanup associated with illegal cannabis cultivation. There's also some conversations about a grant program to assist legacy farmers with environmental mitigation and cleanup as well. So this is essentially the allocation of that funding. Next slide. Go ahead and go to the next, thank you. So this is the other 20%. So this is the state and local law enforcement. And 40 million of that you'll see in that kind of black section is going to be for grants to local jurisdictions. And the initial proposals for last year's amount were due. And I'm going to talk about that a little more. There's also money for DUI impairment, as well as other local law enforcement programming. So next slide, Justin. And then this is the last bucket, and this is the youth education, prevention, and early intervention and treatment funds. And I would just note on this, the 125 million roughly in the orange there, a portion of that actually funds about 3,000 childcare slots for low-income families. So I just always think it's important for all of you to generally know how our cannabis tax money is being spent. And this is the funding projections in the 2020-2021 state budget. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So that kind of gives you an overview of what we've been looking at. There's some other highlights in the budget that I know Nicole is going to cover, and I didn't want to steal her thunder in that regard. So that's kind of the overview of what we're dealing with. Again, we're going to segue into legislation later in this conversation, but that kind of gives you kind of the high level of what we've been focused on from a budget standpoint. As you'll recall in the past, that is where the majority of our work and our major policy reforms have been accomplished, just through the budget process. So that gives you kind of an overview of what we're looking at, and then we'll break down into some more specific highlights. So with that, I'm gonna run through a series of questions with Nicole to talk a little bit more about the budget, ongoing priorities, future priorities, and emerging issues. So I'll begin by just, Nicole, just presenting the first question to you, and it kind of focuses a lot on the budget and then prior efforts that have been undertaken by the administration. So really, it's been about 18 months since the administration took over. And the governor has said on a number of occasions that, it's going to take about 5 to 7 years for things to kind of balance out with respect to the cannabis industry as we adjust to the new regulatory framework. Since that time, I think the governor has tried to undertake some rather ambitious policies on behalf of the industry, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of highlight what some of those priorities have been, are going to be, and maybe what's in the budget now that you think would be a benefit to us.
Sure. Thanks. Thank you, Amy, and thank you guys for having me on today. Excited to chat with you guys in this new virtual space that we operate in. But to your question, just looking back at last year and coming in, I know I started at the end of February, and it was definitely a very, very busy year. A lot of that time was taken to internally and externally assess how, the administration of Proposition 64 had been developed in order to inform some of our future efforts. Some of that we daylighted earlier this year. But notably in the budget last year, we saw a trailer bill that had a lot of provisions in it that were meant to be supportive of creating a sustainable industry, and that included, some civil penalties for illegal activity and supporting illegal activity. We saw provisional licensing, so really stretching the state's ability to administer licensing in a way that allowed operators to ramp up their compliance, as well as to prevent what we called that cliff of people falling out of licensure on the first half of last year. I mean, you saw licensing agencies really step up to that challenge. And then you saw $30 million go towards local equity programs, which was a pretty impressive amount of funding. Above and beyond the budget and the trailer bill, you did see a lot of bills make it to the governor's desk. I know you guys have definitely covered that in some of your previous conversations, but you also saw the governor sign the majority of those bills, and doing so in a way that was aimed at supporting small businesses, access to licensure, craft farmers, expanding research, sort of a plethora, reinstating compassion programs. So you saw, him signing SB 34, the PIT conforming AB 37, and of course AB 1529, the vape cartridge one. So definitely a lot of movement on the legislative front, as I know Amy knows all too well. And then, beyond that, we did a lot of stakeholder outreach last year, including sort of an unprecedented tour of the state where we took, representatives from a variety of state agencies, licensing agencies included, but also some of our other permitting and enforcement agencies. And we visited 9 different regions, sat down with law enforcement, but also sat down with industry and had some really great conversations about compliance and enforcement in areas where we could improve as a state, and using that to inform much of our work this year as well. So really took, and we also talked, to state staff about their experience. We talked to a lot of the industry about the experience with the licensing process specifically. So there was a lot of information collection in order to inform some of the decisions that were made and subsequent efforts that would go towards implementing those decisions that were daylighted in the January budget proposal. And I think Amy alluded to that, but there were some really aggressive reforms that the governor put forward, including the consolidation of the licensing entities into one department, as well as broader tax reform in the space. Of course, we then had COVID hit, and that definitely threw everybody, I think, for a loop. But it definitely, the governor himself, deemed cannabis essential in light of COVID, and so hope, with the hopes that that ensured access for everybody, particularly patients in a space that access is, always challenging at this moment in transitioning to the legal market, and hoping that those operations could remain open and in business, despite there being some challenges on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. With that in mind, consolidation was moved to the next fiscal year, which I'm happy to talk about in more depth, the logic of that, as well as simplification and broader reform efforts in the tax space. But to Amy's point, there is a couple of really great things in the budget this year associated with cannabis in the absence of consolidation and tax reform. And that includes, working to better coordinate enforcement by shifting the Cannabis Enforcement Unit over from Department of Consumer Affairs into the Bureau. And that's a pretty big shift of up to 87 positions. And There's also about 3.3 million in there for a reference lab, and that lab is to ensure integrity across all testing in the cannabis market space. And then there's an additional 15 million, as Amy mentioned, in there for cannabis equity grants as well. So we're seeing a continuation of the equity grant funding, which is super exciting. And then beyond that, yes, going into tier 2, there's all of the funding components that we all know have been earmarked in statute. Of note is $30 million this year going to the California Community Reinvestment Grant Program. So really going back into communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs, and investing in those communities in ways that the state should be investing in those communities since before, Prop 64. As well as tier 3 funding, and a notable part of that is on the environmental side, a potential grant program through the Department of Fish and Wildlife to support small growers in that space and support getting them into compliance, notably from the capital that's required for infrastructure. So a super exciting evolution of funding in that space. So yeah, I mean, I think overall what you saw was a lot of the big plans in January continued into the next fiscal year. I'll note not all big plans that were announced in January were continued into the next fiscal year. So that is a positive thing, despite it being a delay. But overall, definitely working at this moment in time to ensure that we're seeing support for the industry in the context of COVID, and happy to talk about that a little bit more too. That's
Great, thank you for that. So I want to just ask, because it's a common question I get, and you already alluded to it, but maybe we can kind of do a deeper dive into that piece. I get a ton of questions, both from colleagues as well as members alike, about agency consolidation and the timing of that. And just, I think it's important to restate the centralized enforcement piece, where you're shifting Division of Investigation into the Bureau of Cannabis Control as that kind of first step. But in terms of agency consolidation, can you provide any more specifics with respect to the timeline? Is the assumption there'll be a little bit more detail in the January budget? Are there other efforts possibly contemplated for later this year? Maybe you could talk a little bit more specifically.
Sure. Well, definitely the details of the consolidation, the administration has indicated that those will be disclosed in the next year's budget. So if you think of, the language associated with consolidating the department, that initially was slated to be dropped April 1st. I know that was something that was specifically called out in the January budget proposal, and that clearly did not happen. So, you will see that in early January next year. But to the question about, are there things happening between now and then? Yes, obviously one of them was the centralizing of the Cannabis Enforcement Unit and the investigatory capacity that's housed in that unit to better coordinate our enforcement efforts. The conversations that support consolidation, some of it is the boring but important details around labor, around real estate, around financial payment systems, about whether or not we can move forward with a single licensing system. All of those things are happening in the interim and would have continued to happen post July 1st, 2020, for full disclosure, because moving 3 programs into one department in such a short period of time is an exceptionally challenging exercise. And it's even challenging July 1st, 2021. So, to be clear, there's a lot happening, but there's not a lot happening in statute. So that's going to happen in the budget next year, but in the interim, we are looking at things that we can be doing now that will support a smooth transition to one department, things that support just, the industry, things that support local partnerships in this space, to that broad vision you guys have about increasing access. So looking at if there's ways that we can partner with local jurisdictions to help them develop a regulatory framework, implement that framework, and do so in a way that is less burdensome than what a lot of early local jurisdictions have experienced, as well as the technical nuances of merging 3 programs into one and all that comes with that from just the internal state bureaucracy side, things that I haven't even delved into completely, but definitely exist and need to be addressed in order to ensure that's the case. But overall, I would say, the idea of, looking at and this is something I know that was discussed in some of the external outreach last year with industry, what's working with our licensing system, what's not working with our licensing system, and thinking about how we can utilize that moment in time that people interact with the state to reduce barriers. There's going to be a lot of focus in that space as well. So.
Great, thank you. I got a little distracted. There's a lot of questions coming in, and I will get to some of those questions momentarily, but just a couple of quick follow-up items to what you were saying around consolidation. So my assumption is we'll go through the budget process. This will probably occur over probably a multi-year time frame. I'm assuming there's some sort of vision for regulations as well during that as part of that consolidation process. So for the benefit of the participants, I think I would probably assume, based on what you're saying, is again, we'll get through the budget process next year. Something will inevitably, assuming legislature approves, get approved at July 1 of 2021, and then we would probably start contemplating like a regulatory rollout of some sort as well.
Yeah, so the regulations are definitely a part of discussions right now too, and understanding how we can, pursue regulatory changes. I like changes and enhancements, right? Because there's a lot of great policymaking that can be done in the regulatory space. I think the challenge the state's focused with is, while there's a lot of energy behind, revising regulations and, coming out with a new sort of slate of regulations that better serves the industry, there's a balancing act we need to do between, do we do them one at a time? Do we do them all at once? It is exceptionally, I'll say on the state side, speaking for the programs, it is a very challenging effort to do regulations. It can take up to a year and requires, appropriately so, a lot of focus. But with that said, I've also seen it create fatigue on the external side, and especially in the industry. So we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that allows everybody who is impacted by those regulations to have the bandwidth to really engage in that activity. So, there's definitely an approach where you can do 100 different regulations at different times. We're not looking at doing that, because we want to make sure that you guys can all engage in a way that's really meaningful and thorough, so that ultimately the outcome, since the objective is to get regulations that work really well for the objectives of the state as well as the industry, want to make sure that the industry can participate with all of the bandwidth that's necessary to do that. So knowing it takes 9 months to 12 months and that it can be an exceptionally long process, we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that is thoughtful. And we'll be disclosing, I think, as we develop what that timeline looks like, definitely be disclosing that hopefully in the near future.
Great. Thank you. Just in looking at the questions, and I think we could probably help clarify a couple things. So I'm getting a lot of questions, well, not a lot, I'm getting a handful of questions right now about that centralized enforcement. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and we've started to see some communications, the assumption being that we're creating a whole new department, that we're ramping up enforcement efforts. Can you kind of clarify what that centralized enforcement framework looks like? And I would note CCIA advocated for this last year because we thought it would be more coordinated, but can you talk a little bit more about that piece?
Sure, I will to the extent I can, but ultimately is in the bureau's space. But to your comments, Amy, it is better coordination of enforcement more broadly. There are things that inspectors can do, and there are things they cannot do. And when we are functioning in a world where we have, I like to use some of our experiences in Southern California as an example, where we have, retail facilities that are completely unlicensed. That is a harder thing for the current setup to address from a variety of perspectives, whether that be from a sworn peace officer perspective. Inspectors just cannot address that in a way that is meaningful to the legal market. So it allows for better coordination in that space, for being sort of more responsive in that space, but also, taking a step back and looking at the state's overall enforcement efforts. There are a lot of enforcing agencies and programs across the state, and the administration, would like to see that be better coordinated across those state agencies. And part of the vision of consolidating everything into one space is to allow for one entity to really help lead that coordination. And while right now, a lot of that coordination is at least being facilitated by the governor's office, the sustainable and long-term approach is to have that housed in one department. So really convening everybody, making sure objectives are being met, defined and met, I should say, from one space. So overall, it is, meant to, yes, shift an existing program into a department to allow for that coordination to be more effective. So.
No, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. And there's a question about the public safety grant program, but I'm going to hold off on that really quick because I also want to talk about, we touched on briefly potential regulatory changes or modifications to the existing regulations post consolidation. But as I've shared with you, I know Lindsay has as well, the CCIA Board of Directors, in partnership with our policy committees and lobbyists, are developing a list of issues right now for consideration by the administration. I would note some of these could be legislative proposals, some of these maybe could be administrative actions, but we're kind of framing it, kind of going back to the post-pandemic objectives of reducing cost pressures, trying to remove barriers, all revenue neutral, at least presumably. Right now, I think we probably have a document that has well over 40 different recommendations. Is the administration contemplating, and we're going to be prepared to share that with you very soon, but in the meantime, is the administration contemplating any changes to the regulatory framework prior to the consolidation process kind of commencing? So in the fall, perhaps.
You mean like running bills to support that?
Well, potentially some of these could be done through statutory changes, but is there a avenue to make additional modifications to the regs prior to consolidation, which would necessitate kind of reopening the regulatory process?
Yeah. So like I said, we are working on that timeline right now, and I think there are, it sounds like you guys have been doing a lot of work since 40 plus. I can't wait to actually see this document. But with that said, I think it depends on what's in there and what's sort of a meaningful change now versus later. As I think I said earlier, a regulatory change that is not an emergency change is an exceptionally long process.
Right.
I mean, we want to make sure that the process that we pursue is going to be a meaningful process for everybody involved, including you guys on the industry side. So with a goal of not having, 10 different regulatory processes moving at once. But with that said, if there are regulatory changes that have merit as far as for the here and now, and they are needed now, I think we're always open to those conversations. So perhaps once you transition that document to the public space and you're able to share that, I'm happy to have a follow-up conversation about any of those items that you think rise to the top as far as being immediate term needs out of a future and longer regulatory process. And that can inform our timeline.
Okay, I appreciate that. It's been quite an undertaking, and we are hoping to have that wrapped up so that we can present it to you during the first part of July. So looking
Okay.
forward to those conversations. And that kind of leads me to a follow-up. What, if any, tools does the administration have to affect change to the regulatory framework without going through that process? Are there kind of creative mechanisms that the administration is contemplating?
Well, I think that there's, there's always space on the administration side to make changes. And it's always sort of a calculated decision about when to do that and whether or not you make those permanent or you keep those on the administration level. So when I think about changes that could happen on the administrative side, and I think about examples of where we did that, yes, provisional licensing was enabled through a trailer bill, but a lot of the administration of that and the clarifying of exactly what changes needed to be made to ensure that provisional licensing could occur was left to the programs. And we will take that space and we will definitely maximize our work in that space to ensure we're seeing outcomes. I would have loved to have seen consolidation happen, July 1st, 2020, like so many of you probably, and was, a little bit bummed that we had COVID get in the way of that. But with that said, that doesn't mean that the work that we're doing to, create this sustainable industry isn't happening in earnest behind the scenes. So the same goes with the administrative changes. If you guys have ideas about what those changes could potentially be, areas where we could put more energy into in the absence of consolidation happening this year, I'm all ears. Because oftentimes I think you guys as boots on the ground, know where those spots are. So yes, there will be administrative changes. There will be efforts to, beef up the, the website and the resources and the way that we're, like I said, the way that we're working with local governments. All of that can be done absent regulation changes and statutory changes. There's a lot of work that we're doing to build out that side of our world in anticipation of consolidation, but it should be happening anyway, quite honestly. So a perfect example is outreach to locals. We will be doing more of that. We will be supporting the development of in certain circumstances, we will be supporting the development of their efforts to regulate a legal market in their space with the hope that we see, access provided.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit to taxes. Obviously, we've had a lot of conversation about taxes. You and I, you with the board, you with the members. So CCIA has been in communications with the legislature about the potential of freezing or suspending the CDTFA authority to increase the tax rate. So it would be the excise tax wholesale markup, or the AMP, and then possibly freezing the authority to adjust for inflation, or unless it's adjusting down. But we're having those conversations with the legislature, who have been very sympathetic to an increase in tax rates. And I know there's a lot of discussion about trying to keep things revenue neutral, but we would argue this concept would in essence be a revenue neutral proposal. Do you have any comments or thoughts about that? Would the administration potentially support that if it's constitutionally authorized or can be done legislatively?
So I have a couple of thoughts about it. First, you guys saw the markup is, so the July 1st markup stays the same.
Correct.
PSA. So that's happening July 1st. But subsequent, so I can't speak to a legislative proposal that, one, hasn't materialized, but also two, would obviously need to speak to the governor before going public about any specific position. But with that said, I think what this shows is how challenging and complex the existing system is for implementation, and the understanding of what that markup means when it comes to collecting, the 15% excise tax. And so, if anything, I think it further drives home our point that simplification is needed for the administration, but also for the industry in total. So I would just say that, you know, that just gives me a little bit more energy to focus on,
Right.
that we can all get behind for next year. But yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about simplification. So again, that was one of the casualties of COVID, if you will, is that those conversations really ceased. But there continues to be a lot of interest. So, you know, based on your opening comments and your comment now, my assumption is that you are still intending to engage in those conversations. So can you maybe describe a little bit about what you think that process will look like or the timing of that?
Sure. I believe that you know, the governor indicated the timing would be sometime next year. And looking back at, you know, December, January of last year and this year, respectively, the governor did indicate that he wanted to see clarification provided in this space, and that he was willing to engage with the industry, with labor, with the legislature on trying to come up with a, you know, broader reform. That is a challenging conversation. It was made clear when we daylighted our proposal, and I think overall we have objectives that we want to meet, objectives about, you know, supporting small businesses, making this easier for the, you know, the remittance and overall the collection and administration of the programs. And there are objectives that you guys have, there's objectives that labor has. We want to make sure all of those objectives are captured, and then collectively work towards a solution that will work for the majority of people engaging in that conversation. I don't know if we can find the silver bullet, but we will most certainly try. That we can have those conversations, obviously, between sort of when budget wraps this year leading into next year. So is that we can pick those conversations up in July and move them forward. So thank you in advance for participating in that discussion. Looking forward to working with CCIA on that.
Great. And is tax reduction still a conversation piece that you guys are open to as well? I know there was placeholder language in the January budget for further discussion around that issue.
Yeah, and we specifically put forward a proposal on simplification, knowing that there would be additional conversations between industry, labor, and legislature on reduction. And I think, you know, we would love to see, you know, everybody come up with what, you know, in partnership with us, with what that solution would look like. I think our biggest hurdle is, you know, ensuring that we can get the support on the legislative side to meet that threshold. So yes, there is generally support for broad reform, simplification, reduction. All of that is a component of that. But again, we have to put all of our objectives together, and those objectives clash in some areas. So we need to figure out a proposal that meets as many of those objectives as possible. And I can't say, you know, a predetermined conclusion of that will be, you know, a reduction wholesale. I think it's require conversation and trade-offs.
Fair. Okay. Switching gears a little bit, I wanted to, sorry, that was a text that came in.
Somebody didn't like my answer. I don't know.
No, it's unrelated. I don't know how to turn it off on my computer. I'm sure somebody knows how to do that. So wanted to ask you a little bit about hemp. So that is a very common question I get. What is happening with hemp? As you know, CCIA has been in the past part of a broader coalition in support of the development of a framework for the legal manufacture and retail sale of hemp, which would include you know, involvement and the ability of the cannabis industry to participate. Is there a path this year in your mind? Is there anything being contemplated that you can share?
We sure would like for there to be a path. I think, you know, when you talk about casualties of COVID, this was definitely one that was on track to have a lot more progress made in the early half of this year with Aggie Curry's office. And I believe we're still working hand in hand with her office, trying to come up with a resolution in this space, particularly when it comes to food and beverages. But that does also require the California Department of Public Health to be very engaged in that conversation. And we're, you know, very cognizant of the fact that their efforts are very much focused on COVID-related matters too. So I think a lot of it will be subject to what we see with COVID through the latter half of this year, and whether or not there's space on their part to really engage in that conversation. But with that said, it is our full expectation that there is progress made in that space, hopefully this year, hopefully.
Okay.
We're to putting in the sweat equity on that one. So.
Okay, great, thank you. Switching gears again, just kind of trying to cover a couple highlights of things that I think have come up in conversations. Cannabis banking, banking access. I know that it's been a CCIA priority. Most of our focus has been on federal efforts. And I'm aware that the governor has had some conversations and has been engaged. Can you kind of share some of the work that's been done and if you see any movement on the cannabis banking front?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think there's a lot of work on the federal side, right, that can, should, needs to be done. And the governor has engaged in that space, whether that be through, formal support that he put towards states and Safe Banking acts, I should say. And then he's been doing a lot of work behind the scenes with our federal partners in this last early part of this year around the HEROES Act. And cannabis being a part of that. Now, with that said, acknowledging that, federal is federal and we will advocate, there's, to the extent that we can do more work on the state level. I know that our DBO has been doing a lot of great work in that space. They, issued their state chartered banking guidance last year, but they also created the state cannabis banking task force to try and really get, the individuals who are working on the federal side as well as the state banking side together to see where we can come up with areas of progress in that space, and ideally where we can start to create relationships of trust with our federal partners to support more banking in that area. We also have, some work happening on the GoBiz side of things to try and work with banks, as we indicated previously, the iBank funding, knowing that there are not any, if any, there are likely not traditional lenders in this space, trying to create partnerships with financial institutions to support lending in that space for cannabis businesses. I'm hoping we will see progress on that this year. I know that our iBank team is definitely tuned into the nuances and complications of that issue as it relates to cannabis and financial institutions, and they're working to strengthen those relationships in the hopes that we can start to see not only more banking, but potentially lending, which would be huge.
Great, thank you. I'm getting an audience question about the Economic Recovery Task Force. As you know, there's been a push on the part of the industry to have a seat at the table as an essential business. So I think some feel that with the industry deemed essential, that the cannabis industry should also have a seat on that task force. Why aren't they on the task force from your perspective?
I didn't create the task force, so I can't. But with that said, a couple of things. One, I've heard this comment made by the industry, and while I definitely sympathize with it, I will say that overall cannabis and the work that the governor has put and will put into supporting the transition of this industry to a sustainable legal market is not replicated for all industries across the state. So I would say that cannabis has a very special place in the administration and is definitely a focus of the administration when it comes to overall stability. Now that's happening alongside economic recovery, right? So, the governor's focus is ensuring that we're creating a sustainable industry, and that focus is this administration remains laser focused on that effort, despite there being a recession and despite there being this overall broader economic conversation. There are individuals on that task force that are familiar with a lot of the challenges that the cannabis industry faces. So in the absence of a cannabis specific person, I know that there are at least individuals who can speak to those nuanced issues. And also, I know this is something, Amy, you and I have talked about as well, feeding information into that task force to ensure that they're further reflecting the concerns and desires of the industry and the recovery conversation specific to economic recovery, and not necessarily, well, I know they're not mutually exclusive, but to the overall effort that I'm working on. That is something that we are also working to do. So really pushing those ideas up through the task force. It is over 100 people at this point, so it's definitely a lot of people working on this issue. But I know that there are very receptive ears when it comes to taking those ideas and engaging in those discussions that need to be had on behalf of the industry.
Well, I look forward to having further conversations with you about that, because it is a question that keeps coming up. And so I think for the benefit of our members and our board, I'll want to make sure that, at least I would like to see open channels, as they have always been with you, just so we know that we are communicating to the task force in a meaningful way and ensuring that we are represented. So I look forward to further conversations with you about the best approach to that.
Definitely. You'll always have a receptive ear here, and then, wherever I hear of a need to fill a vacancy, I'm advocating. So
okay. So I know we're running out of time, and I did want to touch a little bit on some legislation and things, and I have a question about the one of the grant programs that I still have to answer. But I wanted to just, CCIA has been communicating through our letters and other correspondence to the administration. We really do feel that this industry is poised to be a leader in economic recovery. It's a very rapidly growing industry in other states. We have good paying jobs. We can contribute to economic stimulus. Is the administration contemplating cannabis in any of its economic recovery conversations? If so, what does that look like?
So I think, speaking to some of the comments I just made, so we've had a long-standing goal of creating a sustainable industry that has, a measurable impact on the illicit market, and that towards stronger communities and public safety and public health. That focus has not changed despite heading into being in a COVID-induced recession. And so, this is a really sustained effort that I don't know if you've seen, this sort of effort in all industries across the state. So it is a special sort of effort of the administration that does not exist across the board with all industries. Now, when it comes to being a part of the economic recovery, I don't think that, so let me say this, tax revenue, and this was part of the governor's, then Lieutenant Governor at the time, Blue Ribbon Commission study where it talks about how, bringing in maximum tax revenue should not be the objective. The objective should be good public policy. So in light of our current efforts of creating a sustainable market, we're not going to focus our efforts on maximizing tax revenue. We're going to focus our efforts on creating a market that is actually functioning. Now, there have been a lot of conversations about local jurisdictions looking at potentially opening up if, they look at tax revenue as a way of plugging deficits in their budget. And that's obviously somewhat of an organic process that you might see in the coming months and years. But I think if we're setting up an infrastructure that supports a strong partnership between the state and locals and supports bringing locals online, that's only going to help that effort of expanding access and seeing the industry move into a significant portion of the state that is not currently open. So I'd say that's where a lot of the energy is being focused right now. They're not mutually exclusive. So the work that we're doing is supporting, overall trying to see economic growth in this space for this industry and for safe consumer access. So I hope that answered your question. They're sort of running parallel.
Right. Well, we look forward to being involved in any and all access discussions and exploring creative ways with you to improve access. As we've always said, you can't address the illicit market until we migrate more consumers to the licensed market. So that starts with access. And so we look forward to those conversations. Any other comments that you want to make? Any closing comments, Lindsay? Did I cover?
You did, yeah. I know we wanted to do just a really quick little ledge wrap up, which
Yeah.
I think Nicole can sign off before we hop into that.
Unless you want to
Yeah.
stay.
Are you booting me out?
No, well,
No, you can.
I just didn't want to burden you with
Okay.
legislative updates.
Well, I really thank you for your questions and your answers to your questions. And I think I covered just about everything on the list from folks with the exception of one, which I'll get to in just a second. So Nicole, you're welcome to stay on, or you're welcome to sign off. But I do.
And also a big thank you. We appreciate your time this morning and helping to educate our members. And hopefully this will provide our folks more opportunities to get involved and have our voices heard. And we appreciate the open communication you've always had with us. So you will be getting a very large, robust document on the regulatory report.
I can't wait.
Super
if there
good.
are follow-up questions, I'm happy to address those.
Great,
Awesome.
thank you.
And you are more than welcome to stay on.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
So Justin, if you could just skip the next slide and just jump over to ledge. So it's like 2 slides ahead, I think. So we can get past that one. Okay, perfect. So just really quick, everybody, in just the final few minutes, I wanted to cover a few items. So first, cannabis-related legislation. There are actually 11 bills left, though I suspect some of those will fall off as we are moving into bills being heard in the second house, but I just wanted to highlight a few we're tracking. I listed them by category. So we have the Rubio bill around enforcement. So this, again, this allows locals to impose fines and penalties up to $30,000 per violation per day for operators or individuals that knowingly aid and abet in unlicensed cannabis activity. That bill flew out of the Assembly. It's pending in the Senate. There are 2 quality assurance testing bills. One is CCIA is very involved with around establishing metrics in areas where testing lacks metrics, and and then therefore leads to differences in terms of pass-fail with respect to testing labs. That bill would provide more consistency. And then there's a Bradford bill that authorizes testing labs to receive testing samples from state and local law enforcement. On the banking side, I'll just mention the Hertzberg bill. This would establish a state bank charter. This bill was made a 2-year bill last year, and the author is still alive and well. The author is trying to contemplate what to do to move forward with that, but I do get a lot of questions, and so we'll be continuing to engage in conversations with Senator Hertzberg as he assesses how he wishes to move forward in the final months of the legislative session. So next slide real quick. So I also want to just cover a couple outstanding and emerging issues, some of which we already touched on. So these are brand new developments or things that are ongoing. So I alluded to the cannabis tax rate adjustment. We are working with the legislature and have developed language that we have shared with the legislature that would freeze CDTFA's ability to increase those rate adjustments, both the COLA adjustment for cultivation as well as the markup rate for purposes of calculating the excise tax. The hope is that we will get this into a budget bill during the August process. There is indications that there will be additional budget conversations after we assess what our personal income tax returns look like. So when the state has a better revenue picture, we can expect more bills. So that is something that is in the works that CCIA is very involved with, and we wanted to make you aware. We posed the question about the regulatory framework for hemp. That is ongoing. I was encouraged by Nicole's comments on that. There's a coalition that's working very, very hard to try to determine what that framework should look like and in a way that benefits the cannabis industry. I also think it's important, you've probably read, there is a newly amended bill, AB 1639, by Assemblymember Adam Gray. This bill added new amendments into its existing language to ban the use of artificial flavoring in cannabis vaping products. This bill was amended last week. I'm getting a lot of calls, as is Lindsay and Josh and other members of the team, Want to assure you that we are engaged in conversations with the author concerning intent, and we'll be communicating through our normal policy committee channels and our regular member updates on next steps, whether it be amendments, strategy, and so forth. So I wanted to flag that bill. It's one that we're getting a lot of questions about, and just assure you that we are trying to figure out an appropriate position and approach and strategy, and are engaging with the author. And then I also just wanted to point out, just back the, thanks Justin, just one more, just the administrative, regulatory, and statutory changes. Just to reemphasize, we have a very robust document that the board has been working very, very diligently on that will propose numerous changes, more immediate than consolidation, that we think will provide relief to the industry. And we look forward to sharing that with you more broadly once that document's complete. And also thank you, because we did take input from all of our policy committees and members. So we look forward to having that conversation with you as well going forward. Next slide, please. I know we're on the up on the noon hour. Two things I want to emphasize that I think is important that we don't talk enough about, although this will be covered a lot on Friday, the California Cannabis Equity Grants Program. So the first round of allocations were awarded to local governments for the current fiscal year 2019-20. I listed here the allocations, just under $30 million to the cities of Oakland, LA, San Francisco, Sacramento, Long Beach, and the counties of Humboldt and Mendocino, and then smaller technical assistant grants for program development in Palm Springs, San Jose, Santa Cruz, Clear Lake, Coachella, Stockton, Lake Monterey, and Nevada counties. I mentioned this because I get a lot of questions about the equity grants. I would encourage those of you who are operating in jurisdictions that received equity funding to reach out to those local jurisdictions. I get a lot of individual questions about this, so I wanted to emphasize this. There could be some technical assistance opportunities for individual operators if you meet that criteria. So wanted to put it on your radar. And then the last one before I conclude and take any leftover questions is the next slide. And this is the one, I did receive a question about the Public Health and Safety Grant Program. So this is that bucket of money that is allocated for a local law enforcement grant program. Interestingly enough, and this answers a question from Gabe earlier, what the Board of State and Community Corrections did when they developed the RFP process is, in lieu of focusing exclusively on local law enforcement, what they decided to do is allocate funding based on 4 project purpose areas, or PPAs. And so so what happened was, on June 5th was the deadline, local jurisdictions could apply for grant assistance to develop essentially programs in the areas of youth development, prevention and intervention, public health, public safety, and environmental impacts. Now, I would note all of this has to be kind of under the broader framework of cannabis, but what the Board of State and Community Corrections did is they kind of expanded those buckets so that it's not exclusively law enforcement, but other things that aid in a healthy, regulated cannabis industry. I would note that local jurisdictions are only eligible if they authorize cultivation or retail. But if you want more information on this grant program, I think it's something we should pay attention to. It's funded at $24.7 million, so that June 5th deadline is for purposes of submitting proposals to qualify for that bucket. But assuming this budget passes and is signed, there'll be an additional $40 million for these purposes in the 2020-2021 fiscal year. So I wanted to put that on your radar so that you understand how that grant funding could potentially benefit industry. The RFP is an 88-page document. It's a pretty easy read. I'm happy to share it with anyone who's interested. So that really concludes kind of my presentation, as well as with Nicole. I'm happy if Lindsay, I don't know how much time we have, but I'm happy to take any outstanding questions if anyone has any.
I mean, you know, we're a little bit flexible here. If there are folks that are on that want to shoot some questions in, we can try and answer those while folks are submitting kind of final questions here. I want to thank Amy for all of her work putting this webinar together. Very thoughtful in the questions, and I want to thank everyone who submitted questions as well. We appreciate the feedback. We appreciate your contributions, in order to help us understand the pain points that you all are facing in the industry. So keep them coming. Do you want to promote the rest of the webinars that we're hosting this week? Again, tomorrow is risk management, talking about insurance claims and insurance coverage. Thanks, Justin. Perfect. That's at 12 p.m. Wednesday, we're going to do a federal banking update with the liaison group, and then we're going to attempt to do a happy hour so we can socialize a little bit with you all directly afterwards, since we haven't seen many of you in months. Thursday is business development and adaptation with some financial forecasting. And then Friday, again, is our state of social equity in California with a specific look at the situation down in Los Angeles. So we're excited for this week of educational webinars. We hope you all will join us for more. Please go on the website and RSVP. Amy, I wasn't sure if you got any other questions.
I didn't.
Okay.
I did not, but you have my contact information, and you also know how to find Justin and Lindsay and the whole team.
We're pretty available. Yeah, and special thanks again, Amy, for all of your work around the cannabis tax rate. I know that you were vital in crafting that language. So our members, thank you. We thank you. And big thanks to Justin McCarthy and Josh Drayton for helping to promote and get all of this stuff together, our small but mighty team. And we thank everyone for joining. We hope you found it valuable and useful. And we'll see you tomorrow at noon.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, y'all. Bye.